Good afternoon, Noble family, friends, and law enforcement colleagues. I am Dr. Sophine Charles, and I am the chair of the Education and Training Committee at Noble. You are attending a panel titled Silent Killers: The Stress of Policing, Racism, and Sexism on First Responders. On behalf of President C.J. Davis and the Noble Executive Board, I welcome you this evening. Thank you for joining us and attending our virtual conference. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank our sponsors. We have the LIF organization and SAS. They are sponsors of this particular panel. Thank you very much for your contributions and supporting Noble. We are very appreciative of that. I also want to just let you know that the scope of this particular panel focuses on how the stress of policing, racism, and law enforcement and sexism in law enforcement contributes to the demise of first responders, specifically our LEOs, our law enforcement officers. Did you know that last year, 135 LEOs were killed in the line of duty by gunfire, auto accidents, 9/11 related illnesses, and other intentional attacks? Fatalities of any kind are unacceptable to any of our LEOs who are charged with safeguarding public safety. Did you also know that 228 LEOs met the end of their watch due to suicide? That is the particular area of loss that we never really give enough attention to. At Noble, our position is that we need to develop early intervention systems to prevent the fatalities of our LEOs. It's incredibly important to us. In fact, every year, Noble receives approximately 10 proposals to conduct officer wellness and suicide prevention surveys sessions at our annual conference. And we typically accept about 3 or 4 of those proposals that are actually make the conference. And I got to tell you that the number of participants in those officer well-being and suicide prevention workshops are very low. I'm happy to welcome our panel. We've got 4 panelists with us to engage in this conversation. Our first panel is Karen Solomon. Ms. Solomon is president and co-founder of Blue Help and co-author of The Price They Pay. Blue Help honors the service of LEOs who die by suicide. Our second panelist is Dr. LaToya Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a licensed clinical psychologist and president of the Association of Black Psychologists, also known as ABPSI. Dr. Jackson is also the former program chair of clinical psychology at the Department of Humanistic and Clinical Psychology at Saybrook University in Oakland, California. Our third panelist is Dr. Josh Morgan, a licensed clinical psychologist and National Director of Behavioral Health and Whole Person Care at SAS. Dr. Morgan is also a former Chief of Behavioral Health and Informatics at San Bernardino County's Department of Behavioral Health. And last but not least, we have Dr. Carol Penn. Dr. Penn is CEO and founder of Penn Global Visions, LLC. Dr. Penn is doubly board certified, both in family medicine and obesity medicine. Dr. Penn is also a medical correspondent to radio station WURD in Philadelphia. On behalf of the Noble Board, thank you very much for joining us, and we so much appreciate your contributions to this conversation. We will allow each of our candidates, our panelists, 2 minutes to just present your perspective and how did you come to be involved in this area of work and this discussion. We'll start with Ms. Solomon.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. So my name is Karen Solomon, and I am the president and co-founder of Blue Help. HELP is an acronym for Honor, Educate, Lead, and Prevent. And our mission really is to raise awareness for law enforcement suicide, prevent it, and assist the families in the aftermath. I came to be part of this team because my husband has been a law enforcement officer for 23 years. I have a lot of family members in law enforcement, and I just felt like there was a need where mental health was concerned. So this kind of just evolved through some research, a couple books that I co-wrote with one of our co-founders, and we decided that there was really a gap that needed to be filled. So we filled it, and we have been collecting suicide statistics since January 1st, 2016. We collect it year over year, and it is cumulative. So our number tends to change because if somebody tells us there's a suicide last year that we don't already have, we will add it to our database. We collect a lot of demographic information, location, gender, number of children, marital status, veteran status, a lot of information. So this is especially good for us because we do collect the information on Black law enforcement officers. And what we have found is relatively interesting. So generally speaking, the numbers say that the Black law enforcement officers, there's between 11 and 12% of the police force are made up of Black law enforcement. What we found is the suicide statistic that we have of reported suicides to us, that they take their lives at a rate of between 4 and 9%, which is really interesting because we found that the veterans make up about 22% of the law enforcement community, and they are taking their lives at around 20%, which is on par with their demographic. So we don't know why the law enforcement suicides of Black officers is lower. We've worked with a few epidemiologists and some doctors and things like that. And we need a few more years of data before we can present it. We know that they have the same causes of death: alcoholism, depression, cumulative trauma, post-traumatic stress, but we don't know why that demographic group is lower. As well as the female population, the Black law enforcement females significantly lower. We didn't have any suicides in 2019 or 2020 to date for Black female law enforcement. So that's also kind of an interesting thing to look at when we have more data and we can scale it and dig down a little deeper. And as far as sexism, I know this is going to come up later, but I wanted to bring this out as something people can think about, especially for the family members that are watching. We have found through, well, me personally being a police wife, that the female law enforcement officers face a unique challenge that maybe people don't realize. I can't tell you how many wives get angry that their husband was partnered with a female law enforcement officer. So they have to face this challenge of just being a female in law enforcement, but then they face the, why is my husband texting his partner late at night? Oh my gosh, she is going to have some kind of an inappropriate relationship with my husband. So we need to think about that as families and loved ones of law enforcement, that we need to consider that we are creating some of these problems for law enforcement, especially for female law enforcement. And we need to treat them the same as we would other law enforcement officers, meaning men. So I really just wanted to throw that out there. I know we're going to talk about it later, but I wanted you to think about that while we're talking about other topics. So we're going to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about racism, sexism. There's a lot of components to all of this, and all of that does play into suicide because we know that it's not just post-traumatic stress that takes their lives. We know it's not just compassion fatigue. We know that in addition to all of the other factors, whether it's financial issues, personal pressures, domestic issues, anything else that you and I are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, that is compounded by the weight of the job that they do. And especially in today's society with COVID and social unrest, and Black police officers are being villainized by their own community because they are seen as traitors. So all of these factors factor into the suicide. We've had 4 Black law enforcement officers take their life this year. That's definitely on par with other years. I don't expect that it's going to be higher than past years. Last year has been our highest year yet because we've had a slowdown because of numerous issues that have been going on in society. So I just wanted to let you guys know so you're thinking forward to questions and presentations for later in the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you for opening the door, Ms. Solomon. And one note that I'll add to that is I can remember that the wives of police officers way back in the day, they gave the most opposition to female officers coming on the job, not the police officers themselves. But thank you for that. Dr. Jackson.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me here. Greetings on behalf of the International Association of Black Psychologists. I very much appreciate the introduction. One point of correction I must do is I still do serve as the chair for the clinical psychology degree program at Saybrook University. We are predominantly online, therefore I can be mobile, and I'm calling in today from Maryland. I am excited about being here, and first and foremost, I want to honor the long-standing relationship between Noble and ABSI through the Black Family Summit that convenes all of us. And yet, what brings me here today is I'm very much curious about our Black and brown bodies in blue at this particular time. For us as a Black psychologist, it means that our psychology is in the service of our Blackness, it's in the service of our people. Our mission then is to illuminate the African spirit, to liberate the African mind, and empower the African spirit, empower the African character. I say that because as I share my comments, you may hear some differentness between myself and my colleague who just preceded me, Ms. Solomon. It could be because we're coming from a different vantage point, a starting place, I should say. And for me, I'm happy to hear about the low numbers of our Black family taking their lives under law enforcement. And instead of trying to understand why those numbers aren't as high as the others, for me, I would want to say, how do we look at a potential correlation between Black and brown officers who are able to thrive in spite of within the law enforcement system? If there's a correlation with their clearly understanding who they are as people of color and understanding their values and understanding what's strengthening them to get through this. So my point here for me is that I'm very clear that people of African ancestry have been dealing with seen and unseen pandemics for an extreme long time. So we were prepared for this moment, if you will. The COVID-19 and the 1619 racial pandemic is more of, if you will. And more specifically, the COVID-19 pulled back the curtain on the persistent cultural trauma that we've been contending with as people of African ancestry. And when I look, and for me to be very clear, all systems in America are predicated upon systemic racism, or more specifically, white supremacy ideology. That is the blood from which they were born. And in capitalism. So this has filtered into all industries. This is why for every discipline that exists, there is a Black something, just there's an association of Black psychologists, Black social workers, Black psychiatrists. It's because the institutions in which we were born into do not meet the unique, deep-rooted needs of our people, of what's ailing us. And more specifically, what is also part of our survival and capacity to move forward. So what I'm hoping to do in today's conversation is to be able to contribute to what we're calling a courageous healing conversation, to really be intentional about our village, if you will, to help hold the intersectionality of our Blackness with the roles that we play, maybe a mental health worker or a law enforcement in this case, or even looking at the issues of sexism. At the end of the day, they're rooted and intertwined in the persistent and ongoing institutional racism that we're exposed to, implicit and explicit bias that can literally drive us crazy, as well as internalized racism that we are buying into. So this is what I'm hoping to do. And at the end of the day, I hope that we're able to galvanize our Black collective to share more of the knowledge that we have, that we've been able to to reclaim and bring forward as people of African ancestry, because there lies the way forward for us, is bringing that type of cultural information to the forefront.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for that introduction. And I really hope my noble colleagues actually heard the theoretical perspective on how we came to exist as a noble organization. Thank you.
Yes.
Moving forward, our third panelist is Dr. Josh Morgan.
Thank you, Dr. Charles, and thank you, Noble, and my panelists for allowing me to be part of this conversation. Dr. Jackson, I really appreciate, in some ways, being able to hear what you said previous to this, obviously coming from a very different demographic, and being able to listen and learn. That's the beauty, I believe, of these kinds of conversations and conferences, is where we all can continue to ideally hear each other's stories and be able to build a healthier and safer society. I mean, as a psychologist in this whole conversation, what keeps coming back to me is that all of these challenges, all of these systemic issues really reinforce what I tend to refer to, and what I hear increasingly around the country and world, as whole person care. Being able to look at strengths, challenges, workplace, home, education, etc., to be able to say, what is driving challenges? What is driving resilience? What is driving strengths? And that's what I think is also very unique in the law enforcement conversations that we're having, especially right now, is from my side of the healthcare background, quite frequently, we treat people as individuals in a silo. And that was not what any of my doctoral training was about. In fact, it drove me crazy, because my whole doctoral program was about systems, about all of these different aspects coming together to impact what is working, what is not working. That's what drove me, frankly, to be able to come to that data side, the analytics side, evaluation. As a psychologist with a qualitative dissertation, I was always been a little bit skeptical of the role of data, but as Ms. Solomon noted, being able to have numbers out there is a way to help raise awareness of maybe suicide in law enforcement is a big issue. To Dr. Jackson, your point of being able to help raise awareness to communities like my own, frankly, of being able to say, you know what, some of these trends are very real. Data speaks to different kinds of audiences and can give us a more complete, accurate picture of what the need is. So when we start being able to explore, as Ms. Solomon said, of what's really driving different kinds of changes and suicide rates among different types of groups, different demographics, that's where data is important. I see it as an advocacy tool, an extension of my becoming a licensed psychologist to be able to help people. At the end of the day, our LEOs are there to help people, right? We are there to help make our communities healthier, to help them be safer. This is an opportunity, I believe, to be able to bring information, bring our systems together to better identify opportunities to support our LEOs, brothers and sisters, and say, what can we do to build your resilience, to build your strengths, to empower you, to identify perhaps proactively and preventatively of this is where there may be a challenge, and how can we change not just you, actually maybe our systems. And being able to increase our systemic awareness, I believe, is what will continue to move us forward. Looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Morgan. One point that I'll just connect with is the data that you speak of. We have the data in terms of the number of law enforcement officers that are killed in the line of duty and those that are killed by suicide. But the one that gets the most attention is the one where officers are killed in the line of duty, even though the numbers are smaller, certainly important, but smaller. Thank you. Dr. Penn.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles, and to my fellow panelists and Noble. I am Dr. Carol Penn, doubly board certified in family medicine, obesity medicine, and also a master movement meditation and mindset coach. My interest in being here today and my involvement really started from childhood. My father spent his career in law enforcement, and I currently have many family members in law enforcement. So my interest is both professional and personal. I also have many police men and women as patients. So I see it in real time in the primary care world. I also am faculty for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine based in Washington, D.C., and faculty for Rowan University School of Osteopathic Medicine. So on the academic side and the work that I do with the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, we have been involved in working with police officers, members of the fire department, members of law enforcement from our work during 9/11, our work during any of the national disasters that you can think of in recent history, and also down in Broward County over the past 2 years after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas tragedy, where we're working with law enforcement as well as the school system. So I really see it from sort of the micro and the macro. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is what are some of the tools of resiliency and self-regulation that we can bring to law enforcement professionals to help them navigate and manage the incredible stressors of life today, the stress of policing. And I'm just going to ask everyone to imagine training a police officer's self-awareness, capacity to self-regulate, attention, compassion, and other behavioral health measures. Imagine a police officer who skillfully understands and regulates his or her judgments and bias as they show up in diverse communities. A police officer who takes in situational intelligence and processes these data with greater cognitive clarity and agility, absent the entanglement that fatigue and chronic stress often bring. Imagine a police organization with a culture that supports whole person fitness as a means to optimize performance and humanity.
Thank you for that opening statement, Dr. Penn. And again, Dr. Penn, you were with us in New Orleans last year. So you are a contributor to Noble for a number of years. And we thank you for your contributions to our LEO's well-being. Thank you. So in terms of the pressure that police officers face in the work that they do, I have a colleague who was high-level executive commander in one of the large police departments, and he is one of the first. And so he wanted to leave that job. And I placed a lot of pressure on him saying, you know what, you're a person of color, you're the first, you really need to stay in that spot as long as you can. And he said to me, I'm taking 10 to 15 Tylenols a day because I have a headache, and I can't sustain that. And so that's just an example in terms of the amount of pressure that people of color face in law enforcement. And I want you to respond to the question of how does one's work in policing give rise to the trauma and stress and the unknown and unintended consequences of career outcomes? And I'll ask Dr. Jackson to respond to that, followed up by Dr. Penn.
Great. Beautiful. Thank you. I was hoping I could begin to contribute to the question because as I appreciate all that my colleagues are going to bring to the table, I understand it, I concur, I too am trained in that way. What I would submit, though, is it's not going to be enough for the unique experiences of people of African ancestry in such positions because how we are trained in our dominant disciplines does not go deep enough. And I'll give one, because the narrative you just told about your colleague is a narrative that's felt across all disciplines. I have the same experience serving as the chair in the clinical psychology program. We continually find ourselves as the first in something, in a leadership role. And we all know that with that leadership comes greater complexities. In academia, for example, we see that many educators, Black educators, are the least ones to be tenured because the type of work that they're doing is really feeding the souls and spirits of other Black students behind them. It's a deeper level of mentorship. So for me, when I think about this question, I would ask the audience to first be curious about how did a group of people survive enslavement for 400 plus years? The fact that we are still here is evidence of our spiritness. And as a trauma-informed trained clinician, I would submit to you the language of trauma, the language of resilience is still not sufficient enough because these are new contemporary concepts. But how do we really deeply understand how a group went through all that they did and are still standing today? Because that would be our spirit. And understanding that level of spirit it is greater than the individual space. It is a collective space. I am because we are because I am. I'm able to sit here today because I know there are others who are like me sitting in the same space. Even though we may be an N of one around the table, if we know who we are and whose we come from, then we know we're not really alone in all of this. So as we hear the rest of the gifts that the colleagues will bring on the panel, I will echo those, but I think it still needs to be a deeper dive, and that is the scholarship and the science that Black psychologists and also the members of the Black Psychiatrists of America have brought forward. What our challenge is, how do we get this information out to our people? Because most times we're going to be giving you words for what you're already experiencing. For the value of a sister friend, the value of being with someone and feeling their spirit and knowing that this is a safe place. Well, we have the African science behind that. And this is not necessarily something that's going to be aware to our colleagues when you're coming in for care and treatment, because this is what we're doing, studying who we are, moving that science forward, providing this cultural intelligence, cultural awareness, cultural science, so that our folks can use it for their own betterment.
Great, thank you. Dr. Penn?
Yes, well, I agree. It is very, very important that when we're looking at unpacking racism, when we're looking at the systemic impact of racism and the 400 years of history, and then beyond that, the Middle Passage, and then beyond that, the continent of Africa and the 54 countries that make up the continent of Africa, and the thousands and thousands of tribal groups, family groups, communal groups, that we do look at the African science, that we do make ourselves available and knowledgeable about the wisdom traditions that have been carried forward and are in fact a part of the newer science of epigenetics. So if you think about what we know about the gene and the information that's carried in the gene, we used to think that our genes were our destiny. That's not true. It is about what sits on top of the gene, if you will, the epigenome, which is constantly communicating between the individual and the 72 trillion cells that make up the individual and the outside world. And they're constantly communicating. And it is our lived experiences over time and in present time that really shape our destiny. And what are the ways that we can, first of all, learn that, and to influence that? And that's what a lot of the newer sciences are pointing to. But we cannot just underestimate the absolute power of understanding the wisdom traditions that come from the cultures of Africa that have really contributed to the ability for the African American across all systems and all situations to still have survivability in today's world. And I like to think that I'm contributing to that in some small way. So by using some of these wisdom traditions and bringing them into the experience of mindfulness. This is a lot of work that I do outside of my clinical work because I'm still, under the confines of time, that 7 to 20 minutes that you might actually have with a patient. But my national work and my international work is in this area of mindfulness and meditation and building these skill sets from the point of view of the wisdom tradition that's significant to the person that I'm working with. And since we're talking about African Americans here, Caribbean Americans, the diaspora, a lot of the wisdom traditions that I use and I study are based from the cultures of all over the continent.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Penn. One of the things that you mentioned is the use of meditation. I know that in our elementary schools, meditation has been used to reduce the incidents of violence and bullying. And I think that some of our police departments are using meditation as well. But I would be curious if our audience would let us know if your department is using meditation and also its outcome. Dr. Morgan, and then Ms. Solomon. Same question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments from Drs. Jackson and Penn. I think it's important for us to consider what is trauma in many ways. There's these obvious big traumas, both historical and in the moment. There's also, I don't want to say little traumas because that kind of invalidates it and minimizes things, but just even remembering what our even clinical definitions of trauma are and being able to call something what it is. Law enforcement officers put their lives on the line every day. Having a risk of death or bodily injury fundamentally is a trauma. Do we reframe things from that perspective of within law enforcement that in some ways functionally you are traumatized every single day? And so many people have great resilience and continue to move forward. This is where there's that fine line, as I've been thinking about this and hearing the conversations as well, is we tend to hear this emphasis on certain pieces of the story. We hear about the negative impacts of trauma and how it negatively impacts someone's performance. And that's important to be able to address. But that also creates additional levels of stigma and discrimination beyond the racism, sexism that we're talking about here. How often do many of our communities, let alone the law enforcement community on top of that, don't even want to address trauma? I love that in this question, there is this unknown, unintended consequences. I think that that's really, really critical of being able to pay attention to what may be a little bit more under the surface, what we may not connect. Dr. Penn, your comments were really, one of the things that inspired me to part of this conversation was connecting back to, in my training and kind of my culture in psychology, I love the work of Viktor Frankl, Frankl, for those not familiar with him. He was a Jewish Austrian psychiatrist who ended up surviving the Holocaust when most of his family died. His whole emphasis was on meaning making. And what I'm hearing in Dr. Jackson and Dr. Penn in some of your conversations is there is deep meaning in many cultural traditions, in these wisdom traditions. And that's what has allowed such resilience, such strengths, such survivability. That's true in law enforcement communities. That's why many people become law enforcement officers, right? There is meaning in the work. One of the fundamental things about trauma, though, is it attacks our ability to make meaning in our context. And that's another piece that I think often goes unheard. And some of our organizations, probably like Blue help us probably tell the story, even of people whose lives have been taken by themselves, by others, and even in suicide. That's functionally in some ways by us as a community. What is the meaning in that? Is there a way to continue to move forward? Meaninglessness, hopelessness are some of the core consequences of trauma that often go unnoticed. And that has many massive impacts both on career and private life.
Great. Thank you. And Ms. Solomon, I'd like you to respond to that question. You are our frontline subject matter expert when it comes to suicide in this particular instance. Could you please respond?
Sure. So I thought it was pretty interesting. Everybody brought up some great points. And one of the most interesting points is to remember. So it was mentioned that we are collecting data. Data is important. Yes, it is. But data is also terribly boring. And what we also collect is stories. We want to talk about what happened behind the scenes. We don't want to know just that it was a white or black or, male or female officer. We want to know what brought them to the point, what other factors were influencing them. And almost unanimously, and I'm just going to put it this way, and I think you'll understand. Someone said to me, why are you only collecting law enforcement suicide? Why not everybody else? Well, there are people collecting that information. The distinction here is that they are law enforcement officers. So their trauma, their unintended consequences is a direct result of being a law enforcement officer, because one of the biggest things that we have found that families say they couldn't get help or they couldn't get enough help because they were a law enforcement officer. So that unintended consequence becomes their inability to seek help because of their job. And that is singularly unique to this profession. And honestly, I think that's the biggest thing that I have to say in answer to this question, because it happens to nearly every single officer that takes their life. It's because of their inability to get help.
And officers don't come or ask for help because of what happens within their departments. Very often their weapons are taken, they're put in non-patrol functions and sidelined. And so it becomes a stigma and in some cases a punishment. So why should I come forward and ask for help when I'm going to be penalized for asking for help? Dr. Jackson wanted to follow up.
Yeah, just a closing comment here, because I'm thinking about the diverse listeners when you say family and others who are of the loved ones or part of the circle of care for those who are in law enforcement. What I wanted to add too is that when we think about the benefits of mindfulness, here's a good example. Many times we have not gone deep enough to understand its roots in Africa. The Kemet, which is the origin of all wellness, right? I want to give a shout out for what Dr. Carroll said in terms of her work, but I'm giving this general observation that in most places when we introduce the idea of meditation, we do not locate it in our Blackness. The reason why that is important is because we have some Black Christians who do not accept or recognize meditation. And that's unfortunate because it's really ours, if you will. So that's an example for me of what happens if we don't clearly understand our cultural wisdom and knowledge, because then we don't recognize what's already ours. And then the last thing I wanted to share too is that Dr. Wade Nobles has said many times, we are African by nature and American by nurture, meaning that the DNA of our Africanness is still here. There's reasons why we do what we do. However, we cannot underestimate the long-standing residual impact of being cut off from our culturalness. I too am a fan of Frankel, but even the narrative you just gave, Frankel knew who he was. He knew who he belonged to, so he could therefore name what he was going through and hold on to his wisdom to move forward in contemporary times. This is what Dr. Maramba Ani will speak about, is that before the time of enslavement, we were in a state of mayat, our wholeness, our wellness, we had our own science, our ways of being. Yes, there were problems in our Africa based on the different tribal approaches, but they belonged to Africa. However, during the time of this enslavement, when it went across the globe, this is what we call an mayat, which is an African Holocaust. And the unique space is if you could imagine taking an eraser and just erasing people's minds from what they already knew. And then forcing them into a new language, which means forcing them into a new culture, and then forcing them to try to define who they are in a culture that never respected them from the very beginning. I'm saying this just to be explicit because as our people are listening to this conversation, what I want to hold on to is all of the wisdom that my colleagues and I can bring to you from our Western ways of being is helpful, but is not going to be deep enough until we do our own deep dive into what it means to be of African ancestry, to understand the values that we have here and how to name and claim it as we move forward. And that is what the Association of Black Psychologists would like to gift and join in with Noble and others, is having these critical conversations to create a healthy village.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. We will definitely follow up with ABSI. And let me just let you know that some of our audience are weighing in on the discussion. At this moment, I've got the New York City Department of Corrections. The chaplain initiated a wellness center for staff, and they're using meditation and yoga as stress relievers.
Beautiful.
And I'm also seeing that another department is using mindfulness, and it's new, but they are receiving some positive responses, but still too early to tell what the outcomes look like. And this is really important. One of the things that Dr. Penn mentioned is when an officer is able and taught to self-regulate, that we don't see the knee on the neck types of scenarios that we've seen in Mr. Floyd's case. And that's a really big deal, to teach someone to self-regulate and also be able to monitor their biases and how they respond.
Yes.
So those are some really good key points that you presented. And, you know, I just want to say that I'm a retired sworn officer from NYPD, and I have lost.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I have lost colleagues to both gunshots, killed in the line of duty, and also suicide. And I got to tell you that each loss was incredibly painful.
Yes.
But I'm still left with the suicide saying, was there anything I could do? And that's something that happens in the law enforcement community all the time. Any thoughts about that?
I think one thing I would offer, again, is getting us grounded, is that many people, again, of African ancestry, because that's our primary focus here, but of course, this is not exclusive, so I do want people to be able to extrapolate for its meaning making for them. But it's important for us to understand that we've been socialized to deny our feelings. We have been, when Black women share their feelings, they're called what? The angry Black woman, right? We see that constantly. When our Black men are supposed to be strong and keep it in. So what I'm trying to say here is that one of the tools that can help us all do more better is being able to really have courageous healing conversations. What is it like to be able to take a moment and deeply talk about the challenges of being in Black skin in this country and wearing a blue uniform, and having that being genuinely heard, not valued, not judged, and also being received, and then for others to be able to hear that as well too. I do think that that's going to be one significant contributing factor, is allowing ourselves to do that and bearing witness to one another and having safe Black spaces to do that in.
Great, thank you. And did I see a hand, Dr. Morgan?
I was going to say something, but I can.
Go ahead, Dr. Morgan. We'll follow up with Dr. Penn.
Thank you. One of the themes that I keep hearing here that I think is worth calling out very explicitly is the value and role of community, of social support. I mean, from each one of us. And there can be sub-communities, there can be large communities. Again, there's something I think that's unique, especially in the law enforcement world, that bond between people is particularly valuable. And Dr. Charles, you being able to share your story of different ways that people have lost their lives. And I would, as a psychologist, I think I'd be remiss to emphasize losing in some ways their physical lives, right? We minimize the importance of really our psychological, mental, emotional, whatever term we want to throw on it from our different perspectives. But we all probably also know people who may be physically living, but aren't really living. Right. That's important as well. And the value of social support is so critical. And when we start moving into the world of a pandemic where we're all isolated, and yet I've shared with some of my family, like, in some ways, I'm glad it's in 2020 where, look, we can have this conversation here still. It's not the same, but we can have connections, we can have community, we can build social support. And that's what I'm hearing in everybody on this panel is one of the big goals is to continue to be able to share one another's stories in a variety of ways, be it a boring number, and I agree, Ms. Solomon, data can be very, very boring, but we can enhance it. And with that story, with the meaning making, that's where we can continue to move forward and save lives.
Thank you. Dr. Penn?
Yeah, so I would just like to say, Maya Angelou has been quoted as saying, there's no greater pain than the pain of an untold story. So one of the ways that I like to work with people is small group facilitation outside of a therapeutic modality, but it is where people can come together, create a safe space, there's some structure involved, and then you get to speak your truth into the center of the circle without judgment, without interaction. Everyone else is trained into that deep listening. This is not the fix me group, because sometimes the person just needs to say their story uninterrupted, be heard. They need to do the ugly cry and not have people jump up and stuffing the tissues in their hand. That might be their only moment that they've ever had that opportunity to speak that truth and the power of that. And that can be a very, very powerful tool to be brought into police departments, different agencies that are trying to shift the culture and give people individual empowerment and individual, a highly refined skill set around resiliency and self-regulation.
And let me just say, thank you for that, Dr. Penn. And let me just say that police officers are not trained and the space is not made for them to tell their stories. They don't have time to tell their stories. They go from scooping up all of the bodies from the gun violence to carrying children and people away from car accidents and dealing with the underbelly of society. And they just don't have time to tell those stories. They have to scoop that up, make that report, and go on to the next incident, and then go home and try and sleep and not have these conversations with their families. And that's another part of the untold story, dealing with the families, dealing with police officers as they watch their loved ones and law enforcement deal with the trauma. Ms. Solomon, tell us what your experiences are in terms of dealing with Leo suicides.
So there's a few facets. I mean, it's very complicated, and in terms of officers telling their stories, you're absolutely right. We find that the family telling the story afterwards is wonderful and amazing, and it helps, but it's not enough. So couple things here, because I see a question here about policy, and it kind of ties together. So somebody asked, what is the role of policy in creating a culture? So the culture of law enforcement is one such that has been created by law enforcement year over year, and it's not a good one in terms of sharing your story and asking for help and admitting that you're not feeling so well mentally. So we've got to change that. So there's a couple of bills. Actually, there was a bill that was just passed, the Law Enforcement Suicide Data Collection Act, is going to require the FBI to collect attempted and completed suicide. So that's a step in the right direction, because that gets this conversation pushed forward, and it gets us the ability to start sharing these stories, because they're going to start collecting more demographics than we can. Then there's another bill that's out there that's asking for PSOB benefits for officers who have diagnosed post-traumatic stress or who had died by suicide with a documented history of post-traumatic stress because of the job. So that again pushes it forward, because earlier you were talking about line of duty deaths getting more attention, and they do, and because it is a different kind of death, but we also don't talk about suicide enough. We don't share the officers' stories. We don't share the officer who took his life with his 4-month-old twin sleeping in the next room because he had an alcohol problem and he couldn't get past it. We don't share the story of of the officer who watched a child burn alive and took his life later. We don't share the stories of the officers who witnessed these crimes, have to get back in their car, go back out on the road, and go to the next call with absolutely no break. So those stories we need to continue to share before and after their deaths. Officers who recover from their mental trauma need to share those stories. That's the only way. But a policy needs to be created so that these officers are not penalized for their behavior. They are not penalized for seeking help, and they are given the appropriate amount of confidentiality to seek help and move forward with their careers.
Thank you.
Sorry.
What should we say to families and colleagues of officers who have taken their lives? What do we offer them?
Can I tell you what not to say?
Yes.
Do not blame them. Do not ask them personal details about the suicide. Do not tell them that you understand that the job probably killed them. Support them. Every single department has an off-duty policy, an off-duty death policy. They are entitled to that same benefit that is given in an off-duty death. So whether it's an honor guard at the funeral, whether it's a portion of their benefits, whatever it is, that's what you need to do. You need to uphold yourself. You cannot deny an officer anything from an off-duty death policy because it's a suicide. You cannot blame that family. You have no idea what is going on. Please, that is the number one thing. These families are cast aside. They are blamed for the suicide. Their children are left to fend for themselves, and we simply cannot continue to do that. We need to support them the way we support the deaths by cancer, off-duty car accidents, everything. They are still and have given their career to their communities and their lives.
And I'd like to expand the conversation again, too, first of all, from a strength-based perspective and from a culture-affirming one, and just name the elephant in the room. What we're really talking about, and Dr. Charles, you did it most eloquently, is that this is another aspect of the reform that's needed within the law enforcement in general. It's more than the current call for the safety within Black communities, but it's also for the safety of the minds within law enforcement, because the way in which you just described it, that is inhumane. I mean, we are real, breathing, living human beings. Unfortunately, the negative stories that we're hearing and seeing, including the unfortunate taking of life, is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. People are not supposed to be seeing this much pain and anguish and horror and going about like it's their business time. So for me, for both answering for the families and for law enforcement, as someone who's here to support Noble, I'm curious about how can there be a shift in the culture and the policy making of law enforcement, so that it's to be expected to be able to have some downtime, to be able to care for your psycho-spiritual needs based on what you're being exposed to. And it will minimize the need for those stories. I would like to see the numbers for suicide go down for everyone, and definitely for people of African ancestry. So to the families, what I would say is, starting from the very beginning, first and foremost, as a law enforcement person, you have to understand and be clear that your family is in this with you. So it is a holistic, whole family approach. It's not just the individual. So what types of support, conversations, and languaging can they have together as a unit, as one part of that circle of care? Maybe he or she or they are not able to have the space within their law enforcement agency to tend to their psycho-spiritual needs. Maybe that space can be within the family, within the community, within whatever Noble brings to the table outside of the workday.
And the one thing that I will submit to you as having the lead on the Education and Training Committee at Noble is that we need to hear from our chiefs and our law enforcement executives, and to have them on this panel, because they are the ones who are literally picking up the pieces, not just for the person that has committed suicide, but they have an entire department that they need to literally render first aid to.
Correct.
After these deaths occur. So that is certainly something that will be on the agenda
and
for
how can
the
we
next discussion.
And how can we all be of help to you in providing that care?
let's take a minute to talk about sexism, you know, the stress of sexism. Ms. Solomon started that conversation, and Dr. Penn, you can certainly, you know, add to the discussion. Is how do we deal with what solutions do we have for our women? When we talk about racism and sexism, we're dealing with a population that is overlooked when it comes to promotions, prime assignments. They are the most heavily disciplined, and all of those other challenges that women face.
Well, I'll jump in. I feel that women need to make themselves available to, as well as the organizations that women work for. You know, this deep work that we've been talking about, this beloved community that we hope to create, and the cultural shifts within organizations. So when we talk about cultural shifts in an organization, we have to talk about all of that. We have to talk about the cultural shifts needed around racism. We have to talk about the cultural shifts needed around sexism, and also what happens in the family. One of the things that perhaps an organization that like Noble could do would be to offer this kind of community building work, this kind of small group facilitation to the family members of law enforcement officers, male or female, and then also to do special interest group for women who are in the profession, because there are a little different tweaks, a little different needs, a little sets of emphasis and unpacking that we need to do with each group, kind of like peeling the layers of an onion, so that the family members can come to holism, so that the female officer can come to holism. These are some things that in ways that I would like to support Noble and to
Thank you. I'm seeing in the chat room that the Broward County Sheriff's Office, yes, they are sending leadership and peer counselors to the Center for the Mind Body Medicine training. And so that's set up. I believe that's one of the interventions that's coming out of Dr. Carol Penn's area. And yes, for Dr. Morgan, I'm also seeing a question. The question is taking the systemic perspective and moving toward the individual, moving beyond the individual level of treatment. What can agencies do to foster a culture of wellness? One, what is the role of policy in creating that culture of wellness? And we'll have you take that one, Dr. Morgan, if you can.
Yeah, what a great question that I could probably talk for a very long time on that one, as could we all. You know, I would go back to we've had the conversation about the impact of policy and culture going together. They really influence each other. One of the things that I have observed quite frequently is that policy sets up the expectations of how performance is evaluated, how you'll get promoted, how you'll get disciplined, et cetera, be it in law enforcement, be it in healthcare, be it in teaching, et cetera. That often drives data too. Again, that's what got me into the data world of things. How are we evaluated? How are you disciplined in law enforcement? What is reinforced from a policy perspective? What questions do we ask? Oftentimes, you know, from things I have observed, it is around such things as number of arrests you've made. You make more arrests, you're more likely to get promoted oftentimes. Is that what we are really trying to pursue? Is that what we really want to reinforce? If we are valuing wellness, if we value alternative ways of being able to approach things, maybe de-escalating a situation to the point where no arrest is even necessary, how do we write a policy that can actually reinforce those things? What additional data needs to be collected to be able to say, look, we are doing a fantastic job in many of these other areas, not just in the reduction of the negative things? So great. Policy, improving that holistic approach, improving strengths-based, as Dr. Jackson has mentioned, to really highlight those things, that helps prioritize it, is a first step, I would say.
Great, thank you. And so, as you know, we have 1 hour to have an incredibly significant discussion, and we're winding down. Got a couple of minutes, probably about 2 minutes. So in about 30 seconds, could you just give a closing statement regarding this discussion? And we'll start with Ms. Solomon.
I'm going to take less than 30 seconds. I just want everyone that's watching this, the most important thing that you can do for yourself today is to find the resources in your area or nationally that will help you if you need it, whether it's financially, emotionally, whatever it is. Look now, give it to your family, keep it in a safe place, put it in your wallet so that when you need help, you don't have to worry about looking for help. You have it right there in front of you and you can get the help when you need it.
Thank you. Dr. Penn?
I would just like to invite police departments to create a culture that is grounded in a practice of awareness, compassion, and skillful action. And a culture that is so grounded is one that offers greater equanimity to the community it serves and greater resources for health and well-being of the people inside of policing as we reimagine policing.
Thank you. Dr. Morgan?
I don't know how to follow these already. It's absolutely fantastic, and I agree. Being able to prioritize what is really important: compassion, empathy, improving our systems, improving our communities. And I think we do that through listening and through meaning making, both individually as well as a community, and having these kinds of dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson?
I would also echo what Dr. Morgan said earlier in terms of the importance of policy. So how do we actually be intentional in a cultural shift within law enforcement? How do we create a culture where there's a circle of care, both on the job and off the job in terms of loved ones? How do we also increase one's cultural knowledge and awareness, because that too becomes a deep resource for prevention? And how do we increase access to culturally effective and affirming care so that it hits the general as well as the specifics? Because in many cultures, we would say if a white community catches a cold, we catch pneumonia. So there are always going to be some commonalities, but there will always be unique differences based on the special group. May it be women, the intersectionality of that as well too. But please know,
Right.
ABCI stands here, and we have Sawabono healing circles, which are virtual.
Thank you very much. You are incredible panelists, and I can assure you that there will be a follow-up to this on behalf of Noble and the executive board. Thank you for your contribution. Have a good evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
You all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.